Out near the outskirts of Wilmington, nestled between ancient trees and thick fog, was an old, forgotten graveyard, known only to a handful of locals. This place was shrouded in mystery and fear, a place where the living dared not tread. This graveyard wasn't on any map. The tombstones were worn and weathered, some leaning at odd angles, while others had been erased by time. The inscriptions, once clear and legible, had faded into obscurity, leaving behind only the faintest traces of the lives they once commemorated. The locals spoke of unmarked graves, where bodies were buried in haste, victims of some long-forgotten tragedy. These graves were scattered haphazardly, overgrown with weeds and ivy, as if nature itself sought to reclaim the land from the memories of the dead. But what really terrified the residents wasn't just the history. It was the figures, the dark shapes that appeared between the stones at night, their faces covered in shadow, just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. These figures moved with an eerie grace, their presence sending shivers down the spines of those who dared to look. And then there were the rumours, whispers of strange occurrences and inexplicable phenomena that seemed to defy logic and reason. People claimed the dead in that graveyard never stayed buried. They said the spirits there wandered, restless, seeking the warmth of the living. These apparitions were said to be seen drifting among the tombstones, their ghostly forms barely visible in the moonlight. Kyle, Jenna and Sam didn't believe in ghosts. They thought the whole town was just scared of a few old stories. To them, the graveyard was just another place, a relic of the past with no real power. So one night, they decided to visit the graveyard. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they set out to debunk the myths and prove to themselves that there was nothing to fear. They arrived after dark, their flashlights trembling in their hands as the wind howled through the trees. The graveyard was hidden, overgrown with ivy and weeds. The air was thick with decay, the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves heavy in their lungs. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if the very air was charged with the weight of countless souls. "This place is messed up," Kyle muttered, glancing around at the rows of tilted gravestones. His voice was barely a whisper, as if he feared disturbing the silence. "Yeah, but that's just age," Jenna said, trying to sound brave. She forced a smile, but her eyes betrayed her unease. But even Sam couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shadows stretched longer than they should have. The trees loomed like silent watchers, their branches swaying ominously in the wind. They made their way deeper into the graveyard, the ground soft and uneven beneath their feet. The tombstones seemed to whisper, as if they were trying to tell them something, warn them. Then they heard it, a sound that sent chills down their spines. A faint crackling noise like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. It was a sound that seemed out of place, too deliberate to be the wind. Sam stopped. "Did you hear that?" His voice was barely audible, a mix of curiosity and fear. Jenna looked at him, her face pale. "It's just the wind." She tried to sound confident, but her voice wavered. But Kyle's face had gone ashen. He pointed ahead, his hand trembling. There, between two gravestones, was a figure, a shadow. It stood motionless, its form barely discernible in the darkness. At first it was still, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it glided across the graveyard, its steps silent, as if it didn't touch the ground at all. The figure glided across the graveyard, its steps silent, as if it didn't touch the ground at all. The air grew colder, the whispers became louder, clearer. "Leave this place." The words seemed to echo in their minds, a warning they couldn't ignore. Kyle froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Jenna laughed nervously. "Okay, this is getting creepy. Let's go." She tried to sound casual, but her voice was tinged with fear. But Sam wasn't moving. His eyes were locked on the figure, his lips trembling. "Guys, it's coming closer!" His voice was barely a whisper, filled with dread. Then the figure spoke, its voice inhuman, guttural, like it came from the depths of the earth. "Come closer!" The words were a command filled with an unnatural power. Jenna screamed, "We need to leave now!" Her voice was high-pitched, filled with panic. They turned and ran, but the graveyard seemed to stretch on forever. No matter how fast they ran, the tombstones seemed to close in around them, trapping them in a maze of the dead. No matter which direction they went, the gate was always just out of reach. It was as if the graveyard itself was alive, shifting and changing to keep them trapped. The ground seemed to pull at their feet, slowing them down. The whispers grew louder, like hundreds of voices pressing in from all sides. "You cannot leave." The words were a chorus of despair, echoing in their minds. And then they heard the footsteps, heavy, dragging through the dirt. The sound was relentless, growing closer with each passing second. Sam turned to look back. There was nothing there. But the sound of footsteps was growing closer, closer. It was as if the very ground was alive, pursuing them with a malevolent intent. But the sound of footsteps was growing closer, closer. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified in the silence of the night. Jenna tripped, falling to the ground. The whispers filled her ears, faint voices calling her name. "Help me, please!" The voices were desperate, pleading, as if they were reaching out from beyond the grave. Kyle grabbed her hand, pulling her up. "We have to go! Run!" His voice was urgent, filled with fear. They sprinted toward the gate, but the shadows seemed to reach for them. Their vision blurred, the graveyard spinning around them. The once familiar trees now looked like monstrous silhouettes, their branches clawing at the sky. Finally, they reached the gate, but when Kyle tried to open it, the latch was stuck. The whispers turned to screams, and the sound of footsteps grew deafening. It was as if the very air was alive with the voices of the dead, urging them to stay. Just as it felt like the shadows would consume them, the gate creaked open, and they were out. The sudden release was like a breath of fresh air, the oppressive weight lifting from their shoulders. They didn't stop running until they were back in the town, breathless and terrified. The safety of the familiar streets was a stark contrast to the horrors they had just experienced. The next day they went back to the graveyard to prove to themselves that nothing was wrong. But it was gone. The place that had terrified them the night before had vanished without a trace. The entrance had disappeared. The graveyard was no longer there. In its place was an empty field, as if the graveyard had never existed. The only thing left was a single, fresh grave, with a name written on the stone that none of them recognized. The sight of it sent chills down their spines, a reminder of the night they would never forget. Have you ever found yourself hopelessly lost, confused, and feeling like you were being watched? Beware. There are terrifying and mysterious beings that few have ever seen and lived to talk about. The world is full of secrets, and some are better left undiscovered. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and follow us for more. Join us on TikTok and YouTube for more bone-chilling chronicles, if you dare. The tales we share are not for the faint of heart, but for those who seek the thrill of the unknown.